Hey, yo, the streets don't forget nothing. Let's break this down the wise way.
In the early morning of April 11th, 2023, at the Elite at City Park, right in the hallway on the second floor of a bustling apartment complex in Atlanta, came sudden, urgent knocks on a door. "Please, help me." A chilling voice slipped through the gap between the night and the silence, drifting into rooms still deep in slumber. Before the day could greet the sunrise, police officers found a woman lying motionless by the breezeway, just a few steps from her front door. The victim was later identified by police as Ashley Burton, a transgender woman. She was a hair and fashion designer, an artist in makeup, and a beloved figure in her community. It is believed everything began inside Ashley's apartment before spilling out into the hallway. That day, an argument escalated, forcing the door open. Ashley ran to seek help from a neighbor, and her cries faded into the place where the wind was blowing through. From there, the story unraveled into a series of chilling questions. Who entered Ashley's apartment in the middle of the night? A stranger or a familiar face? And why did a private moment of stability turn into a life-or-death case? The answers would be revealed in every message, every testimony, and even in the details that seemed meaningless at the scene. Join us as we peel back every layer of this case to see, in the end, whose side the truth is on. And more importantly, will justice truly come for the one who has fallen? Ashley was born in the South, growing up in the kind of afternoons spent on the porch, where the smell of damp grass after rain mixed with the sound of her family's laughter. From very early on, she recognized two things walking side by side: a pair of skillful hands that could tell stories through hair, and the desire to live true to her identity, fully, peacefully, unapologetically. Atlanta naturally became her choice. A vibrant city where salons kept their lights on late into the night, where people could wear what they liked, say what they thought, and come home late without feeling out of place. In her small workspace, Ashley didn't just make people beautiful, she gave them agency. Clients would sit down, look in the mirror, and see a more confident version of themselves. People returned for her cutting, curling, and color skills, but they stayed for her gentle smile, for the way Ashley would tilt her head and softly ask, "Today, you want to look like the version of yourself you would love to, right?" Her family said Ashley would always say, "Live honestly. If they accept you, they stay. If not, that's fine." The toughness of that statement was really a soft coat over a heart that had walked through many judgmental stares. By her side were Patrick, her quiet and steady older brother, and Ivory, her cousin who was also a transgender woman, two constant pillars who reminded her to eat lunch on time, texted her to sleep early before a busy client day, and dropped a heart emoji on a video Ashley posted in the rush between two appointments. To her coworkers, she was the warm light of the salon, arriving early to check her tools, leaving last to put products back on the shelves, keeping her voice soft when clients were many, and carefully testing new hairstyles when business was slow, preparing for the next day's shoot. Ashley dreamed of having a small studio, a weekend corner for free training, walls lined with before and after photos like a diary of self-confidence. She also wanted to take a portrait series of her mother, so she can see she's as beautiful as we always see her. They were modest dreams, beauty built to last, warmth that didn't need to be shown off. But even the most transparent life has shadowed corners that outsiders rarely notice. Working in service blurred the lines between client, friend, and acquaintance. Some were only free very late at night. Some sent frequent messages after hours. Some were unusually generous, and then suddenly upset when Ashley maintained boundaries for herself. On social media, A few connections began with lavish compliments, followed by offers of care that seemed harmless, asking to check her phone just to feel safe, asking her location every hour, assuming pickup and drop-off as a duty. When Ashley posted pictures of living authentically, sometimes a message would come scolding her. Don't be so public about it. Each small detail alone was unremarkable, but when placed together, they formed a pattern of subtle control. Friends had warned Ashley about the kind of person who is open in private, closed off in public, comfortable in enclosed spaces but evasive when under others' eyes. That inconsistency was its own quiet signal. Warm today, cold tomorrow, respectful of boundaries at first, then twisting the rules when refused to set conditions. In the apartment complex, some faces still waved politely through the breezeway, but in private messages, they pressed for meetings outside safe hours. With her flexible work schedule, Ashley often tried to accommodate others, but flexibility, if misread, could become a crack for someone to step deeper into her private life. Among the people who came and went around Ashley, there was an acquaintance named Darius Mills who had been seen in her apartment during very quiet hours. They knew each other, but the depth of their connection, how their contact began, what their conversations reached, remained pieces outsiders didn't have. What everyone did see was Ashley's bright presence in the daytime. Few knew the lines she had to draw for herself each night. Don't look at my phone. Don't come over when I've said it's too late. Don't send messages that make me smaller. Politeness was her professional habit, but politeness, when misread, was easily taken as agreement. Ashley's portrait was not just that of a gifted stylist. It was also a map of layered relationships, where affection and admiration stood very close to demand, inspection, and control. Hidden in messages that seemed harmless between those just happened to be in the neighborhood visits. Danger could drift in like the wind, light enough for no one to notice, until it was no longer light at all. Before 4:30 on an early April morning, the air inside the small apartment still seemed to hold the scent of freshly blow-dried hair and the faint music from the night before. The initial conversation between Mills and Ashley was tender, caring, shaped like a loving visit. A few polite exchanges, a couple of questions about health and plans for the next day's work. But quickly, the tone shifted. Voice layered over voice, growing sharper, colliding like two straight lines with no space left to back away. Mills's gaze flicked to the phone sitting near the edge of the table, the screen lighting up with a new notification. "Let me see it just to feel better," he said, his voice light but edged. Ashley tilted her head, keeping her voice calm. "My phone is private." A polite refusal, but a boundary clearly drawn. The air in the room suddenly thickened. Even the low music seemed to stop, as if someone had turned the dial. Mills stepped forward half a step, hand reaching out, words shorter now. "Give it to me." Ashley matched the move in reverse, stepping back the same half step, her eyes fixed on that small object, a thing now becoming the focal point of a standoff both understood. If this line was crossed, it would no longer be a loving visit. When Darius Mills yanked the phone from Ashley's hand, the room seemed to freeze mid-beat. The screen still glowed, its cold white light spilling over tense fingers. In those few brief seconds, the breathing of both people tightened, one trying to guard her private boundaries, the other driven by a mix of curiosity and a need to control. Mills scrolled past a chain of familiar icons. Photos, messages, affectionate exchanges between Ashley and friends, calendar notes for future plans. Then he stopped at a few everyday pictures, conversations where Ashley spoke openly about her identity, direct, unhidden, the way she lived every day. Mills's face darkened. The eyes that had been reading the screen shifted to a different gaze, cold and hard, as if they had just landed on a truth he could not bear to accept. Inside Mills, a long-held prejudice flared, a discomfort fed by warped stories, repeated gossip, and narrow standards he wore like armor. It was no longer about the phone. To Mills, It now looked more like evidence to be erased than a personal item to be respected. Ashley reached out, steady but firm. "Give it back to me." That sentence was the final effort to lock the boundary between what was private and the other person's desire to own. Mills did not comply. Instead, he stepped back half a step, keeping the phone out of Ashley's reach, his eyes never leaving the screen. Words spilled quickly like needles. Why? Why would you? Questions that weren't waiting for answers, only spilling the anger of a feeling that had already found its outlet. The room seemed to shrink, holding only two forces, one demanding the right to judge, the other holding on to the right to be herself. The air grew heavy. Ashley stepped back half a step, hand still extended, her voice lower and slower. "Don't do this." It was a plea for two things at once. Don't violate the phone, and don't let prejudice-driven anger take the next step. But to someone already burning in a furnace of bias, every word sounded like a challenge. Heat surged to Mills's temples, dragging along a chain of brutal reflexes. He glanced quickly around the room, as if confirming the world held only the two of them, then reached toward his waistband. In that instant, time seemed to stretch. Ashley saw the movement of his hand, fast, precise, familiar, and understood that anything she said next might not be in time. Mills drew a 9mm. The action was so quick that the sound it made was dry and short, like a period that had been set in his mind beforehand. No more arguing, no more bargaining, only an act pushed forward by burning prejudice. The gunshot echoed close. The short distance between them turned everything into a straight, unbroken line. Flash, force, impact. Ashley staggered, her hand instinctively rising to shield part of her face, her mouth closing around a sharp inhale. The pain did not arrive with brutal images, but with the strange silence that follows a loud noise, leaving bright specks dancing in her vision. She stepped back once, then again, her mind clinging to the most basic truths, still breathing, still conscious, still needing to get out of this room right now. In Mills's mind, everything had slid too far, too fast to turn back. What he had just done was a red line, crossed for a prejudice he couldn't even explain out loud if asked. He stared at the phone still in his hand, as if it bore the blame for what had erupted. Ashley, though badly wounded, gathered what was left of her strength for her next choice. To find another door, another person, another chance at life outside these four walls. In the room that had just lost the quiet of the night, the phone, the direct trigger of the outburst, rested in the hand of the man who had let prejudice drive his actions. And on the razor-thin edge between staying conscious and collapsing, Ashley's will pushed her toward the only visible escape. Ashley clutched her face and ran into the breezeway, the wind making the ceiling lights sway, and began knocking on every apartment door she could reach. At first the knocks were urgent, then clinging, then weakening. "Please help me." Her voice was torn apart by the wind, blending with the hum of air conditioners and the stillness of an idle elevator. Behind her, a figure followed, sometimes close, sometimes at a distance, shadowing her every move, turning the second-floor hallway into a life-or-death track. A few peepholes lit up and then went dark. Motion sensor lights flicked on, catching hurried footsteps, yet the doors stayed closed as if the entire building was holding its breath. There was no shouting, no struggle, only a desperate plea against wooden doors and feet racing to outrun time. Ashley knew this hallway by heart. The last step on the stairwell slightly uneven, the floorboard between two apartments that creaked. But tonight, drained of strength, those sounds felt strange. Her breath broke into pieces, her chest tightened, her hands stung from knocking too hard, too often. In anxious moments, she would usually call Patrick, her brother, or text Ivory, "I'm home." This time, her phone was gone. At one door, someone asked quietly, "Who is it?" But then silence returned. The exit signs flashing felt like a countdown of the last percentages of time she had left. And yet behind her, there was still the sound of cold, terrifying footsteps chasing her without making a sound. From the middle of the hallway, looking toward her apartment, Ashley knew she was only a few steps from the corner, where the wind hit harder and sometimes security made an early round. She kept knocking on the hope that just one lock turning, one latch lifting, one person opening would be enough to stop danger in front of a witness. But the doors chose silence, whether from fear, deep sleep, or disbelief that a please could be that urgent. In that moment, Ashley heard her own voice turning hoarse, as if the wind was pulling each word away. Her endurance reached its limit, her steps faltered. Her vision dimmed as if someone had lowered the lights. Ashley fell not loudly but slowly after spending her last 3 beats on running, knocking, calling. And only a few steps more would have taken her to her door, short enough to break the heart, long enough to feel like an entire night. If it had been daytime, she could have strolled back, opened the door, taken a sip of water, fixed her bangs, and smiled, saying, "All good." But tonight, that distance stretched like a boulevard. Everything went quiet. The hallway wind still blew, the exit sign still blinked, and the figure behind her, the one who had started it all with a demand for her phone, the same man who had fired at her, stood in a spot where the security camera might catch only half his face. And here, time felt bent, where the story of a strong, authentic woman had reached the edge she never wanted anyone to have to test. When police arrived in the early morning, Ashley was already gone. The second-floor breezeway, where only minutes before the sound of desperate knocking had echoed, was now so quiet you could hear the wind rattling the ceiling light. The victim's body lay only a few steps from her apartment door, a distance so short it was heartbreaking. At the end of the hallway, crime scene tape was quickly strung up, small numbered markers placed according to procedure, and the flashing lights of service vehicles reflected coldly on the walls. Ashley's apartment door was still ajar. The lock was intact, but the handle bore the trace of a hurried touch. Inside, signs of disturbance were clear and a few items out of place. The salon chair pushed askew, a cloth draped unevenly over the edge of a table. There was no sign of forced entry from the outside. Everything suggested the conversation had begun in calm and then slipped rapidly out of control. One detail caught the investigators' attention immediately. The victim's phone was missing. In the context of a conflict that began over that device, this fact was immediately logged as a possible attempt to erase evidence or to remove a means of calling for help. Along the walkway, a few faint traces, a heel mark, the edge of fabric, sketched the hurried movement from the living room out into the breezeway. The exit sign above still flashed in its steady rhythm, as if unintentionally counting down the last moments that had already passed. The hour was so early that there were very few direct witnesses. Many residents, when asked, repeated the same refrain: "I'm not sure I heard anything," or "I didn't want to open the door in the middle of the night." Some admitted hearing knocks and footsteps. One or two had glanced through the peephole before closing it out of fear. That collective hesitation in those moments, a mix of self-preservation and doubt, turned the hallway, normally busy in the daytime, into a void at dawn. The task force secured the scene, photographing the entire hallway, logging the timeline, measuring the distance from the victim's position to the apartment door and the nearby turns. Inside, they preserved prints on the door handle, tabletop, and chair edge. The hallway, elevator, and parking lot camera footage was ordered for immediate retrieval as soon as daylight broke, to minimize gaps in the timeline. A hairstyling kit still sat neatly in the living room corner, exactly as Ashley kept it. One small detail, but one that reminded everyone of the ordinary rhythm of her life before tragedy arrived. All these fragments, the ajar door, the displaced items, the missing phone, the witness-sparse hour, came together to form an early picture. This tragedy had not arrived from outside but had been born within a private space, spilling into the breezeway only when time had already become too precious. The rest of that early morning's work was to preserve the scene as intact as possible, so that every small detail could speak the truth of what had happened. The investigation began from the very stillness of that early morning. The rapid response team secured the ventilated hallway in Ashley's apartment, set up a cordon, and photographed the entire scene, from the victim's location, the projected path of movement, to the door handle, light switches, table edges, and chair corners. The apartment door was still ajar. Furniture showed signs of being shifted. There were no pry marks from outside, suggesting the incident began inside and spilled into the hallway. The crime scene unit carefully collected potential touch evidence, searched for latent fingerprints on smooth surfaces, and gathered fiber samples, tiny fragments that could tell part of the story. Everything was tagged and logged with a strict chain of custody, so no detail could be challenged later. At the same time, the outside investigation team went door to door for brief statements. Who heard what, at what time, whether anyone looked through their peephole. The hour was so early that direct witnesses were scarce. Most residents said they hesitated to open the door in the middle of the night or only heard urgent knocking and hurried footsteps. The next challenge was building the timeline. Investigators marked key points: the 911 call, the moment building security was alerted, the time the specialized units arrived. They cross-checked these with system logs, and especially camera footage, hallways, lobby, elevators, parking garage, and the building's exterior. Many complexes have camera blind spots, so the technical team widened the perimeter, requesting footage from nearby stores or gas stations to patch the gaps. They also asked the building's management for technical access logs, if the system had that capability. Early footage showed movement from inside the apartment into the hallway. The rest would have to be filled in with physical evidence, and the few accounts from those who heard something. The biggest obstacle appeared almost immediately. The victim's phone was gone. In modern cases, a phone is a living diary: calls, messages, location, movement patterns. A missing device not only slows tracking but signals the possibility of intentional evidence deletion. The digital forensics team quickly sent an emergency order to the carrier: call and text logs, approximate location by cell tower during the critical window, and the MA/MZ numbers in case the device was reactivated. If the victim used cloud backup services, investigators would first seek legal authorization to access the metadata so as not to damage evidence. These steps require strict legal protocols. The sooner they are done, the greater the chance of preserving the heat signature of data. At the forensic lab, evidence from the scene was processed according to standards. Suspicious DNA and fingerprints were compared against databases. Any fiber trace, skin cell, or uniquely patterned touch mark could connect Ashley's apartment to a specific individual. As for ballistics, the later arrest report noted a 9mm caliber. Firearms specialists examined every fragment recovered, comparing barrel striation patterns to past entries in the ballistic database. There was, of course, no gun recovered on site. This process mainly served to establish type and technical details for prosecution. Meanwhile, the digital forensics team awaited the carrier's response to reconstruct the victim's communication matrix in the days before the incident. Who called her, whom she called, and which time stamps matched her work schedule and client bookings. Returning to the human side of the investigation, detectives spoke at length with family and friends. They built a consistent portrait. Ashley was careful about whom she let into her home, kept a flexible yet structured work schedule, and most of her interactions were with regular clients, people known through her profession. Names that appeared repeatedly in phone records, Facebook messages, and Instagram chats were placed on a priority list. Another layer of scrutiny was legal history. Because later charges would include possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, records officers reviewed whether the key person of interest had any prior convictions, outstanding probation, or other legal restrictions. This step wasn't about labeling someone prematurely, but about understanding the legal context. If a person with a prior record possesses a weapon, that alone is a crime, an important puzzle piece when presenting the broader picture to prosecutors. In the early days, the investigation was like stitching a quilt from mismatched scraps. The building's cameras showed a figure moving at the edge of the frame, making full identification difficult. Witnesses were few. The victim's phone remained off the map. Instead of waiting for a dramatic, smoking gun, the team clung to small details: guard entry-exit logs, guest parking receipts, and Ashley's client appointments in the days leading up to the early morning incident. Each fragment was placed onto a time-space map. The turning point came nearly 2 months later. As data warmed up, investigators linked the case to 31-year-old Darius Mills, a name that had surfaced early because of a prior connection to the victim but lacked a definitive tie. At the time of the link, Mills was already in custody at the Fulton County Jail on an unrelated matter. The accumulated evidence, from communication checks, indirect camera identification, to initial witness statements, formed probable cause for an arrest warrant. On June 6, 2023, authorities announced they had secured a warrant for Mills on charges of murder, armed robbery, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The case file proposed that a dispute over a phone had triggered the conflict. Afterward, the suspect allegedly returned to the apartment to take a second phone, explaining why the initial digital trail had been cut off, slowing the investigation. Mills's existing incarceration streamlined procedure, standard interrogations, forensic comparisons, and matching communication patterns between Mills, the victim, and related contacts. Meanwhile, the field team returned to the residential community. With a suspect named, some residents who had remained silent out of fear began to speak. They described knocking sounds, running footsteps, motion sensor lights flicking on and off, and the moment of hesitation between opening the door or calling security. These accounts, while not naming names, were still critical. They filled gaps about sound and lighting conditions in the hallway and reinforced the objective timeline. For prosecutors, it was essential to present an unbroken chain, from the apartment to the hallway to the moment of discovery, to support such serious charges. During this stage, investigators also re-examined Ashley's life with meticulous care. Her appointments, list of regular clients, and connections close to the date of the incident. This was not to reopen wounds for her family, but to prove in court that Ashley lived by routine, kept clear schedules, and rarely acted impulsively, contradicting any defense narrative that might suggest she suddenly escalated the situation. Each small habit, sending "I'm home" messages to loved ones, placing her work tools in the same corner, turning off music before bed, became anchor points for a credible, detailed portrait of the victim. By this point, the investigative quilt had its borders. The scene supported a scenario that began inside. The missing phone explained the slow digital trace. Cameras and witness accounts reconstructed the hallway segment. The suspect's identification led to an arrest warrant while he was already jailed for another case. The final steps before prosecution were internal stress tests of the picture, probing inconsistencies in statements, cross-checking touch evidence, verifying times and locations through multiple independent sources, and discarding any theory that didn't match the facts. In a case where the community's half-beat delay had helped turn a hallway into an empty space, the only thing investigators could and had to do was fill that space with solid evidence. Images, logs, physical samples, timelines, all stitched together with method, discipline, and respect for the truth of a woman who had lived authentically until her very last moment. On the surface, the phone was the spark, a dispute over control of a private possession that turned tension into danger. But the chain of actions, chasing down and cutting off any chance to call for help, shows a level of determination far beyond a spur-of-the-moment theft. Here, we see the imprint of control and silencing, crossing personal boundaries, taking away the means of communication, then blocking the victim from reaching assistance. Authorities have not confirmed bias or hate as a factor. Yet to the community, the picture matches a familiar pattern of intimate partner violence, where the greatest danger often comes from someone known, not a stranger. And when the target is a black transgender woman, the real-world risk is often higher due to intersecting layers of prejudice, gender, identity, race, compounded by the closed space setting and the late-night hour. In other words, the phone was only the trigger. The will to control was the steady fuel burning underneath. On the day of sentencing, the Fulton County courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension. Defendant Darius Mills was brought in, wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of his waist. The prosecutor laid out all the evidence once more: the forensic reports, security camera footage, witness testimony, and the connection between Mills and the victim. The defense attorney tried to lean on the principle of innocent until proven guilty and raised doubts about certain details, but the jury rejected most of those arguments. After deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict in a firm voice: life in prison without parole for murder, plus 20 years for armed robbery, and 5 years for each firearms charge, sentences to be served consecutively. The gavel came down, marking the end of a case that had shaken the community, while leaving an irreplaceable void in the hearts of those who had loved Ashley Burton. For her family, Ashley's absence could not be measured in anniversaries or court files. It was measured in the smallest moments: an empty chair at dinner, the "I'm home" text that no longer lit up Patrick's phone, the way her mother's hands trembled as she searched for a photo to place on the shelf. They chose forgiveness, a calm and courageous decision, not to erase the pain, but to keep that pain from becoming a chain that bound the rest of their lives. For friends and clients, the salon had lost its familiar smile, the voice that asked, "What kind of confident do we want to be today?" Before the mirror, each work shift ended earlier than usual, missing the hands that would draw the curtains, straighten the shelves, and play a soft tune. And for the community, this was not just another late-night news item. It was a mirror reflecting the doors that stayed shut when someone needed an answer, a very human hesitation, but sometimes one that costs more than anyone can repay. And perhaps the ending should be in the form of an image. Ashley came to Atlanta to make life more beautiful for others and to live beautifully for herself. The story stopped in a quiet hallway, but its echo lingers: sorrow, compassion, and a deep frustration at the quiet cruelty of doors closed too soon.
So let me get this straight. Another one, gone. Fam, another life, snatched off this earth before its time. Ashley Burton, 37 years old, a hairstylist, makeup artist, full of life, full of personality. Stepped outside of her Atlanta apartment that morning, and within minutes, boom, her story was written in blood on the pavement. Shot inside her home, tried to crawl for help, collapsed outside, and never made it back. Now listen, I'ma keep it all the way 100. I don't agree with the lifestyle, but that's me being real. But what I can agree with, and what I won't ever co-sign, is murder. Ain't nobody deserved to go out like that, fam, period. What happened to Ashley was straight up cowardly energy. Dude found out she was a transgender and decided to play judge, jury, and executioner. That ain't gangster, fam. That's weak. That's the type of energy that proves how fragile some men really are. If you don't agree with it, walk away. But don't take a life, fam. Now at the same time, I'ma also say this, because the streets don't bite their tongue. This whole wave of folks hiding the truth, not telling people up front. They're trying to force feed their lifestyle down everybody's throat. Nah, That creates tension, fam. Nah, that builds mistrust. And it ends with bodies in the street. Transparency saves lives, fam. Respect should always go both ways. But let's not get it twisted. Ashley didn't deserve this. Nobody deserved to be ambushed in their own home. Nobody deserves to fight for their last breath on a sidewalk. Her family grieving. Her community grieving. The same world that pretends to care. Tomorrow they'll stroll like nothing ever happened. But I promise you, streets ain't forget. Her death is another reminder that America only values certain lives when it fits the narratives. And trans black women, they are out here dying at alarming rates, mostly ignored, mostly unprotected. You can disagree, as do I, how they live their life. But you can't ignore the fact that their blood keeps being painted red across these streets. So when I speak on this, it's not about pushing a lifestyle. It's about exposing a system and a mentality that keeps failing human beings. Ashley was a human, a friend, an artist, was somebody. And instead, hustle, craft, now we gotta light candles to say rest in peace. That ain't right, fam. That ain't justice, fam. That's another name in the dirt. And we gonna keep speaking on it until these stories stop repeating. But the movement don't forget. And the streets won't either. Streets ain't forget.